The maid did not know that the millionaire was the father of her baby until the day of the birth. The ballroom of the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan glowed with the elegance typical of New York's most exclusive events. Hannah Parker adjusted the gold Venetian mask that covered half her face, feeling completely out of place in the midst of high society. At 25, she was only there because her best friend Rebecca, Chun, the organizer of the charity event, had insisted on her presence. "You need to get out of that mansion once in a while," Rebecca had said, handing her the invitation and the midnight blue satin dress that now hugged her curves. "You can't spend your whole life looking after other people's houses." Hannah watched the dancing couples, remembering how her life had taken unexpected turns. With a degree in literature from Columbia University, she dreamed of being a writer, but economic reality led her to take a job as a housekeeper at the Montgomery Mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut. The salary was exceptional, and she needed to help her sick mother with her medical expenses. "Can I get you a glass of champagne?" A deep, melodious voice interrupted her thoughts. The man in front of her wore a black mask that highlighted deep blue, almost hypnotic eyes. His impeccable tuxedo suggested someone accustomed to luxury. "Thank you," Hannah replied, accepting the glass, trying to ignore the trembling in her hands. There was something magnetic about her presence. "You don't usually go to these events," he said, not asking. "Is it that obvious?" Hannah smiled, feeling her cheeks flush. "You observe everything with genuine fascination. The habitués are more concerned with being observed." He moved a little closer. "Will you dance with me?" The orchestra began the first chords of a waltz. Hannah hesitated for a moment, but something about this stranger made her feel safe. He led her to the center of the hall with the grace of someone who was born to be there. "My name is," he began, but Hannah interrupted him. "No, tonight we can be whoever we want. No names, no real stories." The words escaped his lips before he could contain them. He smiled a smile that seemed to hold 1,000 secrets. "As you wish, Cinderella." They danced for hours, talking about literature, art, and dreams. Hannah discovered that her mysterious partner had a passion for modern poetry and shared her admiration for Virginia Woolf. The connection between them was palpable, electric. When a clock struck midnight, Hannah felt the weight of reality. "I have to go." "Wait." He held her hand gently. "Can we meet again? Some stories are more beautiful when they remain as a single perfect, untouched moment." She replied, quickly moving away among the guests. The next morning, Hannah returned to her routine. At the Montgomery Mansion, the 3-story property in Greenwich, had been her home for 4 years. She coordinated a team of staff and ensured that everything ran smoothly for her employer, Alexander Montgomery, a successful businessman who was rarely at home. What Hannah didn't know was that her fate was about to become irreversibly intertwined with the Montgomerys. 3 months after the ball, she found out she was pregnant. The news hit her like a bolt of lightning. On a clear day, her first reaction was panic. How would she raise a child on her own? But there was something bigger in her heart, an inexplicable love for that little being that was beginning to form. She decided to keep her job at the mansion. The Montgomery family was known for treating their employees well, and she had excellent health insurance. Alexander Montgomery, although distant, was a fair and understanding boss. "Miss Parker." The voice of Mrs. Eleanor Montgomery, Alexander's mother, echoed down the hallway as Hannah arranged the flowers in the foyer. "I hear you're expecting a baby. I hope you're not thinking of leaving your post." Hannah turned around, surprised by the direct approach. Eleanor Montgomery was an elegant woman in her 60s, known for her philanthropy and practical sense. "No, Mrs. Montgomery, if you'll allow me, I'd like to continue working here." "Good, the Montgomerys always look after their own." Eleanor smiled, but there was something in her eyes that Hannah couldn't decipher. "We'll have to make some adjustments. Of course, you can move to the east wing of the mansion where you'll have more space." The unexpected kindness brought tears to Hannah's eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Montgomery." The months passed, and Hannah's belly grew along with her determination. She threw herself into her work with even more dedication, preparing for the baby's arrival, while trying not to think about the mysterious man at the ball. It was during an autumn afternoon, when the golden leaves were dancing in the gardens of the mansion, that Alexander Montgomery finally returned from a long business trip. Hannah found him in his study organizing some documents. "Mr. Montgomery," she began nervously, "I would like to personally thank you for your generosity in allowing me to continue working during my pregnancy." Alexander looked up from the papers, and for a moment Hannah felt her heart stop. That look, that deep, hypnotic blue. "No, it couldn't be. It's the least we could do, Miss Parker," he replied in a voice she knew all too well. After all, some stories deserve more than just a single moment. Hannah's world began to spin there. He was her mysterious dance partner, the father of her child, her boss. The mask had fallen. But the real story had only just begun. Alexander Montgomery's office seemed to revolve around Hannah as she processed the reality before her eyes. His words echoed in her mind. Some stories deserved more than just a single moment. Her heart was pounding so hard that she feared he might hear it. "Why didn't you tell me?" Hannah asked, her voice barely containing the mixture of emotions that threatened to overflow. All this time, Alexander rose from his leather chair, making his way around the mahogany table with deliberate steps. "How could you set the rules that night? No names, no real stories. When I saw you at the mansion the next day, I realized that fate had a peculiar sense of humor. So you just decided to watch me for months, knowing that I was carrying your child." Hannah felt a wave of indignation rise in her chest. The frequent business tricks, the calculated distance. It was all starting to make sense. It wasn't that simple. Alexander ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture Hannah recognized from the night of the ball. "My mother found out first. The Montgomerys have a knack for recognizing their own." Hannah sat down in one of the nearby armchairs, her legs no longer reliable enough to keep her upright. "Eleanor knew. She noticed certain similarities between your story and the way I met Catherine, my late wife," Alexander explained, taking a seat in the next armchair. "It was also at a masquerade ball 10 years ago." The mention of Catherine reminded Hannah of the portraits of her scattered around the mansion, a woman of classic beauty who had died in a car accident 5 years earlier. Guilt began to eat away at her insides. "I don't intend to replace Catherine," Hannah said firmly, instinctively protecting her 7-month-old belly. "No one could," Alexander replied softly, "but that doesn't mean we can't build something new, something of our own." The silence that followed was interrupted by a knock on the door. Eleanor Montgomery entered, her gaze assessing the scene before her with the insight of someone who had been waiting for this moment. "I see you've finally decided to have this talk," she commented, closing the door behind her. "I was beginning to wonder how much longer it would take you two to face the obvious." "Mother," Alexander began, but Eleanor held up a hand, silencing him. "Alexander has spent the last few months trying to find the best way to approach you, Hannah," Eleanor explained, taking an elegant seat in another armchair. "After Catherine, he developed a paralyzing fear of approaching anyone again, but that night at the ball changed something in him." Hannah looked at Alexander, noticing for the first time the shadows of vulnerability in his eyes. "Why organize a masquerade ball?" "It was Rebecca's idea," Alexander admitted. "She's more than just an event organizer. She's an old family friend. When I mentioned that I needed a way to socialize again, she suggested something where I could feel protected." "Rebecca," Hannah murmured, starting to put the pieces together. "Did she know all this time?" "Only that I'd be at the ball," Alexander clarified quickly. "The rest was genuinely unplanned." Eleanor stood up, adjusting her pearl necklace with a practiced movement. "Now that the masks have literally fallen off, I suggest you two decide how you intend to handle this situation. After all, my grandson deserves to be born into an environment of clarity and honesty." When Eleanor left, she left behind a silence full of possibilities. Hannah watched Alexander, seeing him no longer as her distant boss or the mysterious man at the ball, but as someone just as human and vulnerable as she was. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice only a whisper. "That depends on us," Alexander replied, leaning forward. "That night at the ball, I felt something I hadn't experienced for years: freedom, connection, hope. But I also felt fear, the same fear that has made me hesitate all these months." Hannah nodded, understanding the feeling perfectly. "I'm afraid too, of not being enough, of not belonging in your world." "My world," Alexander smiled softly, "my world is much smaller than it seems, Hannah. It's this house, it's the books we love to discuss, it's the way you transform every environment you touch into something more welcoming. And now, it's also this baby." He stood up, holding out his hand to her. "I'm not asking you to decide everything now. Just allow me to be part of this journey, no longer as your boss, but as the man you met that night, without masks this time." Hannah looked at the outstretched hand, remembering how it had guided her in the dance months ago. With a deep sigh, she accepted the gesture, allowing him to help her up. "No masks," she agreed, feeling the baby kick, as if approving the decision. "But let's go slowly. There's a lot to process for both of us." Alexander nodded, still holding her hand. "As long as we need. After all, some stories deserve to be told carefully." Hannah came across an old, dark wooden box while organizing her new room in the east wing of the Montgomery mansion. Inside, she found black and white photographs that captured generations of the family. Alexander's same hypnotic blue eyes reproduced through the decades. "They're fascinating, aren't they?" Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her presence as silent as ever. Every Montgomery carries that distinctive mark. When I saw your eyes that morning after the ball, I was sure you found Alexander. Why didn't you tell me? Hannah asked, instinctively stroking her belly. Some truths need to be discovered at the right time, Eleanor replied, taking a seat in the armchair by the window. Alexander needed to find his own way back to life. After Catherine, he became a shadow of his former self. The mention of Catherine made Hannah hesitate. What was she like? Different from you in almost every way. Eleanor smiled softly. Catherine was intense, impulsive, you're more reflective, observant. Perhaps that's exactly what Alexander needs right now. A movement at the door caught their attention. Alexander was standing there holding a cup of tea that Hannah recognized as her favorite, Earl Grey with a hint of lavender. I thought you might like something to drink, he offered, stepping closer. Her eyes caught the scattered photographs. I see you found the family archive. Your great-grandfather had exactly the same eyes, Hannah commented, showing him a particular photograph. William Montgomery, Eleanor explained. He built this mansion in 1920 after making his fortune in the real estate market. They say he met his wife Margaret during a snowstorm in Boston. She was lost, and he offered her shelter in his office. The Montgomerys seemed to have a talent for unusual encounters. Hannah joked, trying to ease the tension that still hung between her and Alexander. Speaking of dates, Alexander began, clearly nervous. Would you like to have dinner with me tonight? Just the two of us, no masks or pretenses. Eleanor stood up discreetly. I think that's my cue, Hannah, darling. Get some rest. The doctor recommended extra rest in the third trimester. When they were alone, silence filled the room like a tangible presence. Hannah watched Alexander examine the photographs, his fingers tracing the faces of his ancestors. I've always wondered if our son would have those eyes, she confessed softly. Alexander looked at her intensely. And what else have you wondered? Whether he would have your restrained smile, your passion for modern poetry, your peculiar way of frowning when you're concentrating? Hannah stopped, realizing that she had revealed how much she had observed him over the years. You've been paying attention, he commented, surprised. It's my job to observe details, she replied, but they both knew it was more than that. About dinner, Alexander changed the subject. I thought of something simple. On the balcony in the winter garden, the orchids are blooming. Hannah nodded, remembering how she used to look after those flowers herself. At seven? He confirmed, walking to the door. He stopped before leaving and turned around. Hannah, thanks for not running away this time. The afternoon passed slowly as Hannah prepared for dinner. She chose a navy blue dress that highlighted her belly in an elegant way, a gift from Rebecca, whom she still had to confront about her role in the whole thing. At 7 o'clock sharp, she went down to the winter garden. The sight made her stop. Candles floated in small water arrangements, white orchids decorated the table, and soft classical music filled the room. Do you recognize the music? Alexander asked, appearing at her side. It's the same waltz we danced to that night. You've thought of everything. Hannah smiled, feeling the butterflies in her stomach. Or was it the baby moving? Dinner passed with surprising intimacy. They talked about books, about their childhoods, about their fears. Alexander talked about Catherine without reservation, and Hannah shared her insecurities about being a single mother. You'll never be alone, he promised, reaching for her hand on the table. Even if we don't what? Hannah asked, her heart racing. Even if we don't manage to build something romantic between us, Alexander added honestly. Our child will have all the love and support we can offer. Hannah felt tears forming. It's funny how life works. I've spent so long watching this family from afar, taking care of this house, and now you're part of it. Alexander added, his blue eyes shining in the candlelight. Actually, I think you always were. We just needed time to realize it. The baby kicked hard at that moment, causing Hannah to let out a small exclamation. Without hesitation, Alexander knelt down beside her, gently placing his hand on her belly. He seems to approve of the conversation, Hannah joked, covering his hand with her own. Or her, Alexander smiled. The Montgomerys are not only known for their blue eyes, but also for their strong women. The moment was interrupted by a drop of rain that found its way through the glass roof of the winter garden. Soon several more followed, creating a natural symphony that blended in with the music still playing. Maybe we should go inside, Hannah suggested, but Alexander turned his head away. Dance with me first, he asked, holding out his hand, just as he had done at the ball. This time, no masks to hide who we are. And so, under the rain that drummed on the glass roof, surrounded by orchids and memories old and new, they danced. It was no longer a fairy tale with predictable endings, but a real story with fears and hopes, pains and joys, a story that was just beginning to be written. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the corridors of the Montgomery mansion as Hannah felt her first contractions. It was a winter's morning, and snowflakes danced outside the tall windows. Alexander was at a business meeting in Boston when Eleanor Montgomery took charge of the situation with her characteristic calm. Breathe, honey. Eleanor instructed, holding Hannah's hand as they waited for the ambulance. Montgomery babies have peculiar timing. Alexander was also born during a blizzard at Greenwich Memorial Hospital. The medical team moved efficiently. Dr. Patricia Roberts, the obstetrician who had accompanied Hannah throughout her pregnancy, examined her situation carefully. "We still have a few hours to go," she said. "Your baby seems to be choosing a dramatic moment for his arrival." Hannah tried to smile between contractions, remembering how her own life had changed over the last few months after that dinner in the Winter Garden. She and Alexander had established a comfortable routine of getting to know each other, shared dinners, long conversations about literature and art, and planning for the baby's future filled their days. "Alexander's on his way," Eleanor announced, putting the phone away. "The company helicopter has already taken off from Boston." The mention of Alexander reminded Hannah of their last conversation the night before they were in the library, discussing names for the baby. When he surprisingly started talking about Catherine, she always wanted children. He had revealed, his voice laden with restrained emotion. "But the accident happened before we could try. For a long time, I thought I'd never want to be a father again." "And now," Hannah had asked, feeling the baby move as if also waiting for the answer. "Now I know that the heart has an infinite capacity to renew itself," he replied, his blue eyes fixed on hers. "You taught me that, Hannah, a particularly strong." Contraction brought Hannah back to the present. Eleanor held her hand, tightly murmuring words of encouragement. The clock on the wall ticked away the hours with torturous slowness. "My mother," Hannah whispered between controlled breaths. "Has anyone warned my mother? Rebecca is picking Margaret up from the airport right now," Eleanor assured her. "Your friend has been a guardian angel for all of us." The mention of Rebecca made Hannah smile despite her pain after discovering the truth about the masquerade ball. The two had had a long talk. Rebecca confessed that she had always known the potential between Hannah and Alexander, but believed that they needed to meet in circumstances that allowed for a genuine connection. "Sometimes people need masks to show who they really are," Rebecca had philosophized. The bedroom door opened abruptly, revealing Alexander still in his meeting suit, hair mussed from the rush. His eyes met Hannah's immediately. "I wouldn't miss this for the world," he declared. Reaching over to take her other hand, the next few hours became a dance between pain and anticipation. Dr. Roberts was in and out of the room, monitoring the progress of the labor. Eleanor alternated between offering support and giving the couple privacy. Margaret Parker arrived in time to see her daughter enter the final stages of labor. "You're almost there," Dr. Roberts announced. "For the next contraction, I need you to push as hard as you can." Hannah clasped Alexander's in her mother's hands. Mustering every ounce of energy she possessed, the universe seemed to condense in that moment. Her whole life, her choices, the paths that had brought her here, all culminating in this instant. With one last monumental effort, Hannah felt her son come into the world. The strong, healthy cry filled the room, and Dr. Roberts smiled broadly. "Congratulations," she announced. "It's a girl." Alexander cut the umbilical cord with trembling hands, and soon the little one was placed in Hannah's arms. Time seemed to freeze as everyone watched the baby's face. "The eyes," Eleanor murmured, thrilled. "They're just like—" In fact, even as a newborn, it was impossible not to notice the deep, distinctive Montgomery blue in those little eyes that were observing the world for the first time. "Charlotte," Hannah whispered, looking at Alexander. It was the name they had chosen the night before in honor of Hannah's maternal grandmother, Charlotte Montgomery Parker. "It's perfect," Alexander agreed, his voice breaking. He leaned over and gently kissed Hannah's forehead, a gesture as natural as breathing. "You're both perfect." Margaret and Eleanor hugged each other, two grandmothers united by the little life that had just arrived. Rebecca appeared at the bedroom door, carrying a bouquet of white orchids, house favorites. She winked at Hannah. The next few hours were a whirlwind of visits, exams, and moments of adjustment. When night finally fell and the room fell silent, only Hannah, Alexander, and Charlotte remained. "She has her nose," Alexander observed, sitting on the edge of the bed while Charlotte slept in Hannah's arms, "and her stubbornness in choosing the most dramatic moment possible for an appearance." Hannah joked, exhausted, but happy. "Hannah," Alexander began, his voice serious, "I know we're still figuring out what we are to each other, but I want you to know that you've changed my life, not just because of Charlotte, but because of who you are. The woman I met at the ball, the dedicated housekeeper, the extraordinary person who brings light into every room you occupy." Hannah felt silent tears run down her face. "I love you too," she replied simply, "because sometimes the deepest truths are the simplest to say." Charlotte stirred in his arms, opening her blue eyes briefly before going back to sleep, as if blessing the moment with his presence. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering Greenwich with a white blanket of possibilities, while inside the hospital, a new family found their own way home. A week after Charlotte's birth, the Montgomery mansion took on a new dynamic. The baby's cries echoed through the historic corridors, mingling with the soft voices of Hannah and Alexander, who took turns on sleepless nights. The former East Wing, now transformed into a home within a home, was witnessing the birth not just of a child, but of a new kind of family. She has her contemplative way, Alexander commented one morning watching Charlotte intently examine a Star Mobile that hung over her crib. She spends hours just watching. Hannah smiled, adjusting the cashmere blanket Eleanor had made especially for her granddaughter. Like a real Montgomery, your mother told me that you used to spend hours in the library as a child, just looking at books before you could even read. The mention of Alexander's childhood brought a nostalgic gleam to his eyes. Dad used to say that I was absorbing the stories by osmosis. Her voice faltered slightly. He would have loved to meet Charlotte. Hannah took his hand, a gesture that had become natural in recent weeks. William Montgomery Sr. had died 3 years ago, a few months before Hannah started working at the mansion. She only knew his story through Eleanor's accounts and the photographs scattered around the house. Tell me about him, Hannah asked softly, knowing that Alexander rarely opened his heart about his father. He was different from what people imagined. Alexander began, taking a seat in the Victorian armchair next to the crib. The world saw William Montgomery as a ruthless financial tycoon, but at home, he was just Dad, the man who taught me to fish in the lake, who read The Little Prince every night, even when I was too big for children's stories. Charlotte let out a little sigh in her sleep, as if she was listening intently to the story of the grandfather. She would never know. Hannah sat on the arm of the armchair, her shoulder lightly touching Alexander's. After Mom had a miscarriage when I was 12, Dad turned the old nursery into a children's library, Alexander continued. He said that way, even if we didn't have any more siblings, the house would always be full of stories and possibilities. That's why you kept all those children's books in the main library, Hannah realized, remembering the countless times she had organized that particular section. Yes, and now, finally, they'll have a new reader, Alexander smiled, looking at Charlotte. Although we'll have to wait a few years. A soft knock on the door interrupted the moment. Rebecca entered carrying a briefcase and her characteristic air of efficiency. Sorry to interrupt, but we need to discuss the details of the christening, she announced, taking a seat in the nearby chair. Eleanor is anxious to start the preparations. Hannah and Alexander exchanged glances. They hadn't formally discussed the ceremony, although they knew it was an important tradition for the Montgomerys. St. James Chapel is booked for 3 weeks from now, Rebecca continued. Consulting her notes, Eleanor suggested an intimate lunch afterwards, just for family and close friends. Hannah, Alexander asked softly, what do you think? I think it's perfect, she replied, surprised at how naturally the Montgomery traditions were becoming part of her life. But I'd like it to be something simple yet elegant, like you, Alexander murmured so low that only Hannah heard. Rebecca smiled, watching the couple interact. I've already got some ideas for the decoration. I thought I'd use the white orchids from the winter garden. They seem to have a special meaning for you. Before they could reply, Margaret Parker appeared at the door. Since Charlotte's birth, she had temporarily moved to Greenwich, occupying one of the guest rooms in the mansion. Sorry to interrupt, but Eleanor is asking about the christening dress, Margaret said. Apparently there's a dress that's been passed down through generations of Montgomery. My great-grandmother's dress, Alexander confirmed. Every Montgomery baby has worn it at their christening since 1890. It's kept in the attic in a special box. Hannah felt the weight of tradition, of history of the family that was now hers too. Can we see it? Alexander nodded, getting up. I'll go and get it. Mom knows exactly where he is. When he left, Rebecca and Margaret exchanged meaningful glances. Are you happy, dear? Margaret asked her daughter, reaching over to stroke Charlotte's sleeping head. Hannah looked around the room, decorated with such care. Her daughter sleeping peacefully, the people she loved gathered together. More than I thought possible, she replied honestly. You know, Rebecca commented, organizing her notes, when I planned that masquerade ball, I never imagined it would turn out all this way, but I always knew there was something special between you and Alexander, even before you realized it. Sometimes fate needs a little help, Margaret added, smiling. Alexander returned a few minutes later, carrying an antique cedar box. With reverential care, he opened it, revealing a French lace christening gown delicately preserved in tissue paper. It's beautiful, Hannah whispered, gently touching the fabric. Like you, Alexander replied, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made Rebecca and Margaret discreetly leave the room. They stood there admiring the dress that symbolized so many generations, so many stories. Charlotte woke up at that moment, her Montgomery blue eyes focusing on her parents with that same contemplative intensity. "Welcome to the family, little one," Alexander murmured, taking his daughter in his arms. "All the stories that came before you are now yours too." Hannah watched father and daughter, her heart overflowing with love. The mask had long since fallen, but the mystery and magic, those remained, transforming into something deeper, truer. Every day Charlotte's christening was approaching, and with it a series of unexpected discoveries began to emerge at the Montgomery mansion. Hannah found an old box of photographs in the attic while looking for some traditional family decorations for the ceremony. Among the images yellowed by time, one in particular caught her eye, a young girl who could have been her twin sister, wearing the same christening dress that Charlotte would have worn. "Margaret Montgomery," Eleanor explained, coming up silently behind Hannah. "My great-aunt, she worked as a governess in this house before marrying James Montgomery, my great-uncle." Hannah felt a shiver run down her spine. "She was also an employee who fell in love with a Montgomery," Eleanor added with a gentle smile. "Yes, history has a peculiar way of repeating itself in this family." Margaret faced a lot of prejudice at the time, but her love for James was greater than any social obstacle. The revelation made Hannah reflect on her own situation. Although times were different, she still occasionally felt the questioning stares of some members of Greenwich high society when she accompanied Alexander to social events. "Why didn't you tell me about her before?" "Because some stories need to be uncovered at the right time," Eleanor replied, picking up the photograph carefully. Margaret kept a diary during those years. It's kept in the library third shelf on the left behind the Russian classics. Hannah found Alexander in the library that same evening after putting Charlotte to bed. He was sitting in his favorite armchair reading some work papers. "Did you know about Margaret Montgomery?" she asked without preamble. Alexander looked up from the papers, a gleam of recognition crossing his face. "So you found out? Mother always said there was something familiar about you from the first day she saw you. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't want you to think I was repeating a familiar pattern," he explained, putting the documents aside. "How I feel about you, Hannah, has nothing to do with history or tradition. It's about who you are, about how you light up every room you enter, about how you made me believe in love again." Hannah moved closer, taking a seat on the arm of the armchair. "Tell me more about them." "James was my grandfather's younger brother, according to family records. He met Margaret during a Christmas party here at the mansion. She had organized all the decorations, and he was impressed by her attention to detail. Like you when you watch me arranging the orchids in the winter garden." Hannah teased softly. Alexander smiled, taking her hand. "Exactly. They got married in 1952 against the wishes of many in the family. But James always said that some traditions need to be broken so that other more important ones can continue." The sound of the baby monitor interrupted the conversation. Charlotte had woken up together. They went upstairs to their daughter's room, where the little girl watched them with her intense blue eyes. "She has the same determined look as Margaret," Eleanor commented, appearing in the doorway with a cup of tea. "The one that says nothing in the world can stop her from getting what she wants." Hannah took Charlotte in her arms, smelling the soft baby perfume that had become her favorite scent in the world. "And what happened to Margaret and James?" "They lived a full and happy life," Eleanor replied. "They had 3 children, traveled the world, and turned this mansion into a more welcoming place than it had ever been." Margaret never lost her governess essence. She said that taking care of this house and this family was in her blood. Alexander moved closer, wrapping Hannah and Charlotte in a gentle embrace. "As it is in your blood too. The difference," Hannah reflected, "is that now I'm not just the housekeeper." "No," Eleanor agreed with a knowing smile. "Now you're Montgomery in your own right, and in 3 days when Charlotte wears that christening gown, it'll be official for everyone to see." That night, after Charlotte had finally gone to sleep and Eleanor had retired to her chambers, Hannah found Margaret's diary in the library. The yellowed pages contain a love story that could have been her own, the fears, the doubts, the strength needed to face prejudices, and above all, the certainty that some connections are greater than social conventions. "Some people will say, I don't belong in this world," Margaret had written, "but love knows no boundaries of class or social position. It simply is, and in that pure existence we find our true home." Hannah closed the diary, feeling a deep connection with the woman who decades before had walked a path so similar to her own. The sound of familiar footsteps made her look up. Alexander was there, watching her with that look that still made her heart race. "Did you find what you were looking for?" he asked softly. "I found more than that," Hannah replied. "I found our story written long before we were born." Alexander sat down next to her on the sofa in the library, the same one where they had shared so many conversations over the years. Do you know what else Margaret and James left us? What? The certainty that true love doesn't need external approval, it stands on its own truth. Hannah leaned her head on her shoulder, feeling the peace that only her presence could bring. In 3 days, Charlotte would wear the dress that Margaret had worn, that generations of Montgomery had worn, but more important than any tradition was the certainty that some stories are destined to repeat themselves, not out of obligation, but because love always finds its way back home. The day of the christening dawned with soft golden light filtering through the stained glass windows of St. James Chapel. Hannah adjusted the delicate lace dress on Charlotte, her hands trembling slightly as she touched the historic fabric that carried so many stories of the Montgomery family. "You look beautiful, my love," she whispered to her daughter, who gazed at her with those piercing blue eyes, so similar to her father. Charlotte responded with a small smile, as if she understood the importance of the moment. "May I come in?" Rebecca's voice sounded soft through the ajar door of the chapel's preparation room. Upon receiving permission, she slipped inside, carrying a small blue velvet case. "Alexander asked me to give you this before the ceremony." Hannah carefully opened the case, revealing a delicate pearl necklace with a single diamond in the center. A handwritten note accompanied the jewel. "It belonged to Margaret Montgomery. Now it's yours, as it should be, love. He found it in the old family things last night," Rebecca explained, helping Hannah put the necklace on. "Eleanor said Margaret wore it at her own wedding to James." Tears threatened to ruin her carefully applied makeup, but Hannah held them back. "Sometimes I wonder if all this is real," she confessed. "If I'm going to wake up and find that I'm still just the housekeeper organizing other people's lives." Rebecca held her hands firmly. "You've never been just anything, Hannah. And if you want to know the truth, Alexander is nervous too. I found him in the library at 5 in the morning rereading Margaret's diary." The sound of the chapel bells announced that it was time. Eleanor and Margaret entered the room, both elegant in shades of light blue that matched the decor chosen for the ceremony. "The orchids were perfect," Eleanor commented, adjusting the small arrangement of white flowers on Charlotte's dress. "Just as you planned, Hannah." The chapel was filled with family and close friends. Hannah spotted familiar faces among the guest staff from the mansion, who had become family over the years. Rebecca's friends from the Manhattan social circle, Alexander's work colleagues. As the soft music began to play, Hannah carried Charlotte down the center aisle. Alexander was waiting for her near the baptismal font, his gaze conveying more emotion than any words could express. Next to him, Reverend Michael Stevens smiled warmly. "We are gathered today," he began, "to celebrate not only the baptism of Charlotte Montgomery Parker, but also the power of love to unite people and transcend barriers." Hannah realized that he knew about Margaret and James, about her own history with Alexander. The words chosen carried a special meaning that deeply touched everyone present who knew the true story of the Montgomery family. During the ceremony, Charlotte remained surprisingly calm, her blue eyes observing everything with that characteristic curiosity. When the baptismal water touched her forehead, she simply blinked, as if she understood the solemnity of the moment. "Welcome to the family of God and the Montgomery family," the Reverend declared, and Hannah could have sworn she saw tears in Alexander's ever-controlling eyes. The reception that followed was held in the mansion's winter garden, the place that had witnessed so many important moments in her history. With Alexander, white orchids decorated each table, their soft scent mingling with the breeze coming in through the open windows. "Are you happy?" Alexander asked quietly, finding a private moment among the congratulations of the guests. "More than I thought possible," Hannah replied, settling Charlotte in her arms. "I've found not just a love, but a whole story to belong to." Eleanor approached, carrying an old photo album. "I thought you might like to see this," she said, opening it to a particular page. The christening of James and Margaret Montgomery Jr. in 1953. The black and white photograph showed a beaming couple holding a baby wearing the same dress as Charlotte. The resemblance between Margaret and Hannah was even more evident in that image. "History has an interesting way of completing its cycles," Eleanor commented gently, touching Charlotte's face. "Some people would say it's coincidence, but I prefer to believe that it's silent promises being fulfilled through the generations." The afternoon progressed with emotional speeches, soft music, and lively conversations. Hannah watched it all with a sense of fulfillment she had never imagined possible in her days organizing similar events as a housekeeper. "Do you know what Margaret wrote in her last diary?" Alexander asked, finding her again in a quiet moment. "That the Montgomery's true legacy is not in the companies or the mansion, but in the ability to recognize true love When it appears, even in the most unexpected places, Hannah smiled, remembering the masquerade ball, where it all began, like at a charity party when a stranger offers you a glass of champagne. Exactly, he replied, leaning over to kiss her forehead. Some masks allow us to see more clearly. Charlotte let out a little sigh in her sleep, snuggled in her mother's arms, still wearing the historic dress that connected past and present. In that moment, Hannah understood that her story with Alexander wasn't just theirs, it was part of something bigger, an intricate fabric of love, courage, and destiny that stretched across generations. The orchids would continue to bloom in the winter garden, the old photographs would keep their secrets on the library shelves, and new chapters would be written in the Montgomery family history. But now, Hannah knew that she was no longer just an observer, she was a fundamental part of this ever-evolving narrative. A month after Charlotte's christening, Hannah found Alexander in his office late at night, contemplating a series of documents spread out on his mahogany desk. His heavy countenance indicated that something important was troubling him. Has something happened? Hannah asked quietly, entering the office. After putting Charlotte to bed, Alexander looked up, a mixture of concern and determination in his gaze. I've received an offer to sell the Montgomery mansion. The news hit Hannah like a punch in the gut. This house wasn't just a piece of real estate, it was the heart of their stories, the place where Margaret and James had built their love, where Charlotte was growing up, where she and Alexander had truly met. A Boston developer wants to turn the property into a luxury condominium. He continued, running his hand through his hair in a familiar gesture of frustration. The offer is considerable. Hannah approached the table, her eyes roaming over the documents. The figures were astronomical, even by the Montgomery standards. What does Eleanor think about it? I haven't told her yet, Alexander admitted, but it's not just about the money. The mansion needs significant structural renovations. The cost of maintenance has risen exponentially in recent years. Hannah knew well the challenges of maintaining a historic property of this size. As a housekeeper, she had dealt with countless issues over the years, from problems with the original electrical system to the constant need to restore architectural elements. But this house, she began, her voice cracking with emotion. It's our story, Alexander added, getting up to hug her. Believe me, I know that better than anyone. Every room holds memories of generations of my family, and now our own memories too. The baby monitor on her waist picked up a small noise from Charlotte, but soon fell silent again. Hannah thought of her daughter, growing up in the same corridors where Margaret Montgomery had walked, where Eleanor had raised Alexander, where so many love stories had blossomed. What if there's an alternative? Hannah suggested, an idea beginning to form in her mind. The mansion has history, it has character. Perhaps we could transform it into something that preserves its essence, but also generates enough income to maintain it. Alexander looked at her curiously. What do you have in mind? A cultural and events center. Hannah elaborated, years of organizing experience beginning to flow naturally. We could keep the main wing as the family residence, but open up selected parts of the estate for art exhibitions, literary events, selected weddings, like the masquerade ball where we met. Alexander smiled for the first time that evening. Exactly, Rebecca has always said that this place has a special energy for events, and with your connection to the corporate world and my experience in property management. Alexander pulled her closer, his blue eyes shining with renewed hope. You keep surprising me. You know that, always finding solutions where I only see problems. I learned from Margaret. Hannah smiled, recalling her former housekeeper's diaries. She wrote that sometimes we need to reinvent traditions to keep them alive. At that moment, Eleanor appeared at the office door, her silk robe fluttering softly. I heard voices and figured I'd find you two here, she commented, entering the room. And from the amount of papers on the desk, I assumed that Alexander has finally received the proposal from the Boston developer. You knew? Alexander asked, surprised. Honey, I'm a Montgomery. I have eyes and ears everywhere. Eleanor smiled, taking a graceful seat in one of the armchairs. And I must say that Hannah's idea is brilliant. Were you listening? Hannah blushed, enough to know that you truly understand the spirit of this house, Eleanor replied. Did you know that in the 1950s, Margaret organized a series of literary soirees here? She turned the mansion into a meeting place for intellectuals and artists of the time. Alexander looked at the documents on his desk, then at the two women he loved most in the world. Do you really think we can make this work? With the right planning, yes, Hannah replied confidently. We can start gradually, perhaps with a series of test events over the next few months. And I know exactly the right people to help us, Eleanor added. I still keep in touch with various members of New York's cultural circles. The baby Monitor picked up another sound from Charlotte, this time more insistent. Hannah prepared to go upstairs, but Alexander gently stopped her. "Let me go," he offered. "You and Mom can start planning how we're going to turn our house into something even more special." As Alexander went upstairs to attend to Charlotte, Hannah and Eleanor began to discuss possibilities. The energy between them was contagious. Two generations of women united by their love for the same house, the same family. "You know," Eleanor commented after a while, "when Alexander first brought Catherine, she wanted to change everything in the mansion, but you want to preserve its essence, just helping it to evolve naturally." "It's because I understand that I'm not just part of her story now," Hannah replied softly. "Montgomery Manor is part of my story too." The idea of turning the Montgomery Mansion into a cultural center began to take shape. Over the next few weeks, Hannah, Alexander, and Eleanor worked tirelessly on the details of the project, turning the office into a planning center full of architectural plans, event proposals, and financial spreadsheets. "The main ballroom will need a complete restoration," Hannah observed, analyzing the notes she had made during a detailed inspection of the property. "But the original structure is impressive. The 19th century wood carvings are practically intact." Rebecca, who had joined the team as an events consultant, flipped through her tablet with enthusiasm. "I already have 3 art galleries interested in holding exhibitions here. The combination of history and elegance is exactly what they're looking for. And I got an interesting call from Columbia University," Eleanor added, entering the office with Charlotte in her arms. "The art history department wants to establish a partnership for workshops and lectures." Alexander watched the going-son with a mixture of admiration and nostalgia. "Dad always said that this house had a special energy. I think I finally understand what he meant." The sound of footsteps in the hallway announced the arrival of Margaret Parker, who had decided to extend her stay in Greenwich to help with the project. "I've found something you need to see," she announced, carrying a dusty box. Inside the box, they discovered a set of documents and photographs detailing the literary soirees organized by Margaret Montgomery. In the 50s, there were elaborate invitations, guest lists that included famous names from American literature, and even handwritten menus. "Look at this," Hannah exclaimed, picking up a yellowed envelope. "A letter of thanks from Ernest Hemingway after a lecture he gave here in 1953. Margaret turned this house into a cultural sanctuary during a time when women rarely had a say in intellectual circles," Eleanor explained, settling Charlotte in her arms. "She used Montgomery's social influence to create something meaningful." Hannah felt an even deeper connection with her predecessor. Like Margaret, she too was using her position to preserve and reinvent the family legacy, but in a way that was uniquely her own. "We could start with a series of monthly events," Rebecca suggested, making quick notes. "Alternate between art exhibitions, literary soirees, and chamber concerts. Maintain the level of exclusivity, but make culture accessible to a select audience. And use the Winter Garden for more intimate events." Hannah added, remembering how many important moments had taken place in that space. "The orchids create the perfect atmosphere for poetry recitals or book launches." Alexander approached Hannah, placing a hand on her shoulder as he watched the plans take shape. "You're transforming not just the house, but the very meaning of being a Montgomery." "What do you mean?" Hannah asked, turning to face him. "The Montgomerys have always been known for their success in business, for their social influence, but you're reminding us that we can be more than that. We can be guardians of culture, promoters of art, creators of spaces where stories come to life." Eleanor smiled, watching her son. "Catherine wanted to modernize everything, to erase the past. Hannah wants to honor it while building the future. There's a fundamental difference there." Charlotte chose that moment to let out a little twitter, as if to join in the conversation. Her Montgomery blue eyes scanned the room with that characteristic curiosity she was already showing at just a few months old. "What about the East Wing?" Margaret asked, referring to the part of the mansion where Hannah and Charlotte currently lived. "It will remain private," Alexander replied promptly, exchanging a meaningful glance with Hannah. "Some parts of our history need to remain ours alone." Hannah felt her heart race at the hours. It was still surreal how her life had transformed from housekeeper to an integral part of the Montgomery family, from observer to the protagonist of her own love story. "We could start with a test event next month," Rebecca suggested, consulting her calendars. "Something small for a select group of potential partners and sponsors. A literary soiree," Hannah decided, inspired by her discoveries about Margaret. "We could invite some contemporary authors, do readings in the Winter Garden, use the orchids as the central decorative element." "Like that night," Alexander added softly, referring to the dinner where they had begun to rebuild their relationship after the revelation of the masked ball. Eleanor watched the couple with a knowing smile. You know, it's not just a mansion that's getting a new chapter, we all are. Hannah took Charlotte from Eleanor's arms, smelling the soft baby scent that had become her favorite fragrance in the world. Her daughter would be the first of a new generation of Montgomerys to grow up in this reinvented version of the mansion, a place where history and the future intertwine perfectly for Charlotte. Hannah murmured, kissing her daughter's forehead so that she grows up knowing that traditions can evolve without losing their essence. For all of us, Alexander agreed, hugging his family as he looked at the plans that would transform their ancestral home into something even more special. For new stories and old walls. The first test event at the Montgomery mansion was scheduled for an October evening when the golden leaves of fall created the perfect backdrop for the literary soiree. Hannah was overseeing the final details of the decorations in the winter garden where the white orchids had been complemented by seasonal arrangements in shades of amber and bronze. The writers will start arriving in an hour, Rebecca announced, consulting her tablet as she walked between the elegantly decorated tables. We've managed to confirm 3 best-selling authors and 2 award-winning poets. Hannah adjusted a floral arrangement, feeling the weight of Margaret Montgomery's pearl necklace on her neck. She had decided to wear it tonight as a way of honoring the legacy of the woman who decades before had transformed that very space into a cultural sanctuary. Charlotte has finally gone to sleep, Alexander informed her, entering the winter garden. He paused for a moment, admiring the transformation of the environment. It reminds me of that night, the dinner after we found out the truth about the masked ball, Hannah added, smiling as she shared the memory. It seems like a lifetime ago. Eleanor joined them, elegant in a navy blue dress that matched the color palette chosen for the event. Margaret would be proud, she commented, observing the space. Especially the way you've kept the essence of the house while preparing it for the future. The first guests began arriving promptly at 7. Hannah watched with a mixture of pride and nervousness as prominent figures from New York's literary and cultural world circulated around the space that until recently was just the winter garden of the mansion where she worked as a housekeeper. Jennifer Lawrence Boyd loved the story of the house, Rebecca whispered, referring to the best-selling author who had just arrived. She's considering setting her next novel here. The evening progressed like a carefully orchestrated dream. Poetry readings in the winter garden were interspersed with networking moments in the adjacent halls where selected works of art were already on display in anticipation of future exhibitions. It's surreal to think that it all started with an idea to save the house, Hannah commented to Alexander during a quiet moment. They watched from a discreet corner as an award-winning poet recited verses about love and transformation. It wasn't just an idea to save the house, Alexander replied, his voice low and intense. It was you understanding exactly what this mansion means, not just to the Montgomerys, but to everyone who has ever been a part of its history. The baby monitor on her waist picked up a small noise from Charlotte, but before Hannah could move, Eleanor was already making a discreet gesture indicating that she would take care of the situation. The connection between grandmother and granddaughter had become profound in recent months. I think we've found our place, Hannah reflected, observing the natural interaction between the guests and the space, a balance between preserving the past and building the future. The evening reached its climax when Jennifer Lawrence Boyd, inspired by the surroundings, decided to do an unscheduled reading of an excerpt from her next work. A story about a historic house and the secrets it held through the generations. It's like she's telling our story, Alexander murmured, gently squeezing Hannah's hand. Later, when the last guests had left and only the closest staff remained, Hannah found Rebecca organizing the last notes from the event. We already have 5 requests for similar events in the coming months, her friend informed her with a satisfied smile. And 3 galleries want to confirm dates for exhibitions. We did it, Hannah whispered, more to herself than to the others. No, you did it, Eleanor corrected, returning to the winter garden with Charlotte asleep in her arms. You saw beyond the old walls and established traditions. You saw the potential for something new, something meaningful. Alexander approached, gently taking Charlotte from her mother's arms. I think it's time we had a toast, he suggested while Rebecca was already arranging champagne glasses. To Montgomery Manor, Eleanor proposed, raising her glass. To family, Margaret Parker added, having remained discreetly in the background throughout the event. To love, Rebecca added with a knowing smile, remembering the masquerade ball that had changed so many lives. To all the stories that will still be told here. Hannah finished her gaze meeting Alexander's as Charlotte slept peacefully in her arms. The Greenwich autumn continued its golden dance outside, but inside the Montgomery mansion, a new era had begun, an era that honored the past while bravely embracing the future, just as Hannah and Alexander had learned to do in their own love story. The success of the first event at the Montgomery mansion triggered a wave of interest that exceeded all expectations. Hannah found herself immersed in a whirlwind of commitments, balancing her life as a mother, Alexander's partner, and now co-director of the cultural center that the mansion had become one particularly busy. November morning, while organizing the schedule for the next art exhibition, Hannah discovered something intriguing. Hidden between the pages of one of Margaret Montgomery's diaries was a sealed envelope addressed to whoever finds their way home. Alexander needs to see this, she muttered to herself, carefully tucking the envelope in her blazer. Charlotte was playing quietly in her nearby playpen, her soft laughter echoing through the library. I found 3 more requests from publishers interested in holding launches here, Rebecca announced, entering the library with her usual energy. She stopped when she noticed Hannah's thoughtful expression. Has something happened? Maybe, Hannah replied, still processing her discovery. Where's Alexander? In a meeting with the gallery curators at the office, but it should be over soon. Hannah nodded, turning her attention to Charlotte, who was now tightly clutching her favorite storybook, an old edition of The Little Prince that Alexander had inherited from his father. Sometimes I wonder if she feels it, Hannah commented softly. All the weight of the history of this house, this family. Rebecca moved closer, watching her goddaughter with affection. If she does, it's just the love and dedication you've invested in preserving this legacy. The meeting with the trustees ended shortly afterwards, and Hannah found Alexander in his office, still going over some documents. His face lit up at the sight of her, as it always did. I found something, she announced without preamble, pulling the envelope out of her blazer. It was hidden in one of Margaret's diaries. Alexander took the envelope carefully, his blue eyes scanning the elegant handwriting. I recognize her handwriting, he muttered, but why haven't we found this before? Maybe because it wasn't the right time, Eleanor commented, quietly entering the office, as only she knew how Margaret always said that some truths have to wait their time to be revealed. Carefully, Alexander opened the envelope. Inside was a letter dated 1975, a few months before Margaret's death. Dear Finder, if you are reading this letter, it means that you have found your way home, not just to this mansion, but to the heart of the Montgomery family. As I found it so many years ago, there's a secret I've carried with me for decades. When I fell in love with James, we faced more than social prejudice. There were those in the family who tried to break us up, using my position as governess against us. But James never hesitated. He said something that I carry with me to this day. True love doesn't need external approval. It stands on its own truth. In the attic behind the panel with the family crest, there is a box in it, and I've kept all the letters we exchanged during that turbulent period, along with documents that reveal how we managed to turn this mansion into a cultural center. It wasn't just about art or literature. It was about creating a space where social barriers could be transcended through culture too. Whoever finds these words continue this legacy. The Montgomery mansion is not just a house or a name. It is a testament that love can overcome any obstacle, that traditions can evolve without losing their essence. Love, Margaret Montgomery. The silence that followed the reading was charged with emotion. Hannah thought of how many times she had organized that attic without ever suspecting the treasure hidden in its walls. Shall we look for the box? She suggested softly. Alexander nodded, but before they could move, Eleanor said, There's something else you need to know. Something Margaret told me before she died. Hannah and Alexander turned to her expectantly. The transformation of the mansion into a cultural center wasn't just an artistic decision, Eleanor continued. It was Margaret and James' way of ensuring that future Montgomery children would never face the same prejudice they did. By opening the mansion's doors to art and culture, they set a precedent that personal value is more important than social position, like you and Dad did by letting me work here. Hannah realized the pieces falling into place. Exactly, Eleanor smiled. Some traditions are worth keeping. At that moment, Charlotte's cry through the baby monitor broke the solemn atmosphere. Hannah prepared to go upstairs, but Alexander stopped her. Let's go together, he suggested, and then we'll look for Margaret's box. After all, our story is just another chapter in the great Montgomery book. As they went upstairs to attend to her daughter, Hannah reflected on how fate had woven her life with the threads of the Montgomery story. Like Margaret before her, she had found not only love, but a greater purpose in those ancient walls. The future of the Montgomery mansion was secure, not only financially, but in its deepest essence as a place where love and culture intertwined, where old stories inspired new beginnings, and where each generation found its own way to honor the past while building the future. Hannah and Alexander went up to the attic of the Montgomery mansion the following afternoon after Charlotte had fallen asleep in her crib under Eleanor's watchful care. The dusty space held decades of family history, and now somewhere behind the family crest a treasure trove of memories left by Margaret awaited them. "This must be it," Alexander said, carefully removing a heavy carved wooden panel that displayed the Montgomery coat of arms. Behind it, a cavity revealed an old oak box, its varnish weathered by time. With trembling hands, Hannah helped Alexander remove the box from its hiding place. The weight of the history contained in that container seemed tangible. Between them, they sat on the attic floor, ignoring the dust that accumulated on their clothes. "Ready?" Alexander asked, his soft voice echoing in the silent space. Hannah nodded, and together they opened the lid. The scent of old paper and preserved memories enveloped them. Inside, they found dozens of yellowed letters, black and white photographs, and a leather-bound diary that seemed more personal than the others they had found. "My love," Hannah read from the first letter she picked up. "Today I faced yet another meeting with the family council. They insist that our union will tarnish the Montgomery name, that a governess cannot become part of this bloodline, but the more they try to separate us, the more certain I am that our love is greater than any title or social position." "James," Alexander murmured, recognizing the signature at the end of the letter. He really fought for her. They continued exploring the contents of the box, each document revealing more layers of Margaret and James' story. There were original plans for the transformation of the mansion into a cultural center, detailed notes on the first events, and even reviews published in newspapers of the time. "Look at this," Hannah exclaimed, unfolding a newspaper clipping from 1954. "Montgomery Manor redefines the standards of high society, where art and culture transcend social barriers. Margaret really succeeded in changing people's perceptions." Alexander picked up the leather-bound journal, opening it carefully. "This one looks different from the others," he observed, beginning to read. "Dear future guardians of Montgomery Manor, if you are reading these words, it means that you have found not just a box of memories, but the very essence of what it means to be part of this family." Hannah moved closer to Alexander, their shoulders touching as they read together. The diary revealed not only Margaret and James' love story, but a meticulously crafted plan to turn the mansion into a symbol of social change through culture. She planned everything, Hannah realized in amazement. Every event, every exhibition, every literary soiree was carefully thought out to break down social barriers without seeming to be doing just that. "Just like you're doing now," Alexander commented, turning to face her. "Without realizing it, you followed exactly in her footsteps." The baby monitor on her waist picked up the soft sounds of Charlotte waking up. Hannah checked her watch. 2 hours had passed, lost in Margaret's memories. "We should organize a special exhibition," Hannah suggested as they stood up. "Use some of these photographs and documents to tell the story of the mansion. Show how it has always been a place of transformation. And we could do this on the anniversary of the first soiree organized by Margaret." Alexander agreed, carefully putting the material away in the box. "Show how her vision lives on through the generations." They came down from the attic to find Eleanor cradling Charlotte in the library. The late afternoon light streamed in through the tall windows, creating golden patterns on the Persian carpet. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Eleanor asked, although her smile suggested that she already knew the answer. "We found more than that," Hannah replied, taking a seat next to her. "We found an even greater purpose for what we're doing here. Margaret always said that true nobility lies not in the name we bear, but in the actions we choose," Eleanor commented, passing Charlotte into Hannah's arms. "She would be proud to see how you are honoring her legacy." Alexander joined them, holding up some of the photographs they had brought down from the attic. "I think I understand now why you never objected when we hired Hannah as governess," he said to his mother. "You saw something familiar in her. I saw the same light that Margaret had." Eleanor confirmed, that quiet determination, that respect for history, combined with a clear vision of the future. Charlotte, now fully awake, looked at the old photographs curiously, her Montgomery blue eyes shining with interest. "For you, my love," Hannah whispered to her daughter. "These walls will always be more than just a house. They will be a reminder that true love transcends any barrier, and that every generation has the chance to write its own story of transformation." The commemorative exhibition on Margaret Montgomery was timed to coincide with the 70th anniversary of the mansion's first literary sway. Hannah spent hours organizing the photographs and documents found in the attic, creating a visual narrative that would capture not only the love story between Margaret and James, but also the social transformation they had initiated. I found some more letters, Alexander announced, entering the office where Hannah worked with Charlotte playing nearby. They were hidden in a false compartment of my grandfather's desk. The new letters revealed an even more complex side to the story. James Montgomery hadn't just defended his love for Margaret, he had strategically used his influence to change the social policies of the time. Starting with his own family. Listen to this, Hannah read aloud. Dear Margaret, today I confronted the family council with a simple truth: the greatness of the Montgomerys lies not in our name or fortune, but in our ability to evolve with the times. If we can't recognize true value in people regardless of where they come from, then our legacy means nothing. Dad used to say something similar, Alexander commented, taking a seat next to her. Now I understand where he got that philosophy from. Rebecca entered the office carrying sample invitations to the exhibition. The list of confirmations already exceeds 200 people, she informed them, including 3 social historians and a documentary filmmaker interested in turning Margaret's story into a movie. Hannah felt the weight of responsibility in her hands. It wasn't just about preserving memories, it was about continuing a movement that Margaret and James had started 7 decades ago. We need to do this right, she muttered, more to herself than to the others. For Margaret, for Charlotte, for all the people who still need to hear this story. Eleanor joined them carrying a box Hannah had never seen before. I found these in my closet, she explained. They're the dresses Margaret used to wear to soirees. I thought we could create an installation with them. The dresses, although vintage, told their own story, elegant, but not ostentatious. They reflected the personality of a woman who had balanced 2 worlds, that of the devoted housekeeper and that of the wife of a Montgomery. She was like you, Alexander commented softly to Hannah. She knew exactly how to preserve the elegance of the mansion while making it more welcoming. Charlotte crawled over to them, grabbing Hannah's skirt to pull herself up. Her blue eyes examined the antique dresses with childlike fascination. It's her heritage too, little one, Hannah whispered, taking her daughter in her arms. An inheritance of courage and transformation. In the days leading up to the exhibition, the Montgomery mansion took on a special energy. In large photographs were strategically placed to tell the story. Chronologically, Margaret's dresses were arranged on vintage mannequins, each accompanied by excerpts from her letters and diaries. The Winter Garden will be the focal point, Rebecca explained during the last planning meeting. We'll start with a literary soiree similar to the first one, organized by Margaret, followed by the official opening of the exhibition. Hannah had carefully chosen the contemporary authors who would take part in the event. Each one represented in some way the same struggle for recognition and inclusion that Margaret had faced. I found something else, Alexander said the night before the exhibition, meeting Hannah in the library. He was carrying a small velvet case. It was the brooch James gave Margaret when they inaugurated the mansion's first cultural event. The brooch was a delicate piece in gold and pearls, forming the stylized design of a key to the guardian of Montgomery Manor. Hannah read the inscription on the back. It's yours now, Alexander declared softly, pinning the brooch to her blouse. Because you, like Margaret, have understood that this house is more than walls and history. It's a living symbol of transformation. Eleanor watched them from the doorway, her eyes shining with restrained tears. Margaret always said that true nobility lies in actions, not titles. She commented, "You two have proved that once again." The baby monitor picked up sounds of Charlotte waking up from her nap. But before anyone could move, Margaret Parker was already on her way to her granddaughter's room. The integration between the families had become as natural as breathing. Tomorrow, Hannah reflected, gently touching the brooch. We're not just celebrating the past, we're affirming that some stories never end. They just find new voices to be told. Alexander hugged her from behind, both of them watching the sun set through the library windows. And some love stories, he murmured in her ear, are destined to echo through the generations. The morning of the exhibition dawned with a special clarity in Greenwich. Hannah adjusted the brooch that had belonged to Margaret on her navy blue dress. Feeling the weight of the story they were about to share, Charlotte, wearing a dress Eleanor had made especially for the occasion, played with the petals of a white orchid under the watchful eye of her grandmother, Margaret I. Guests will start arriving in an hour, Rebecca announced, entering the room with her usual efficiency. The journalists from the New York Times and the Greenwich Time are already positioned in the Winter Garden. Hannah took one last look in the mirror, noting how Margaret's brooch shone softly against the fabric of her dress. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of continuity of promises kept through the generations. Ready? Alexander asked, appearing in the doorway when he saw her. His gaze had the same intensity as at the masked ball where it had all begun. "I can hardly believe we've come this far," Hannah replied, picking Charlotte up. "Of all the possible stories, this was ours to tell." He added, moving closer to kiss her forehead gently. The winter garden had been transformed into a living gallery of memories. Black and white photographs of Margaret and James alternated with contemporary images of the mansion, creating a visual narrative that spanned 7 decades. The vintage dresses arranged strategically among the white orchids seemed to whisper stories of love and courage. "The historians have just arrived," Eleanor informed us, entering the room. "And I got an interesting call. Ernest Hemingway's granddaughter is on her way. She found some letters exchanged between her grandfather and Margaret in the family archives." The news sent a wave of emotion through Hannah. Each new discovery only confirmed the lasting impact Margaret had left, not only on the Montgomery mansion, but on American culture itself. The guests began arriving punctually at 7. Hannah watched with pride as groups formed around the different installations, absorbing the history. They had so carefully curated the documentary and, interested in the project, kept taking notes, occasionally stopping to photograph specific details. "It's surreal to see all this," Margaret Parker commented, approaching her daughter. "When you started as a housekeeper here, I never imagined that I would find not only love, but a greater purpose," Hannah added, smiling. "Neither did I." The most exciting moment of the evening came when Alexander gathered everyone in the center of the winter garden for a special announcement. Charlotte, now in Eleanor's arms, watched everything with that characteristic Montgomery curiosity. 70 years ago, Alexander began, his voice clear and firm. Margaret and James Montgomery proved that true love transcends social barriers, but they did more than that. Day turned this mansion into a living symbol of cultural change. Today, thanks to Hannah's vision and dedication, we are not only honoring that legacy, but expanding it. He paused, his eyes meeting Hannah's before continuing. "As of today, Montgomery Mansion officially becomes the Montgomery Parker Cultural Foundation, a space dedicated to promoting art, literature, and social change, just as Margaret and James dreamed." The announcement was met with enthusiastic applause. Hannah felt silent tears run down her face, especially when she noticed that the name Parker had been included in the foundation, a formal recognition of her contribution to the Montgomery legacy. "There's one more thing," Alexander continued, turning to Hannah. Her heart began to pound harder as he reached down and pulled something out of his jacket pocket. "Hannah Parker," he said, his voice now softer, more intimate despite the audience. "You've transformed not just this house, but my whole life. Like Margaret before you, you proved that true love knows no barriers. You've given me a wonderful daughter, breathed life back into these old walls, and shown me that some stories deserve to be rewritten." Then, to Hannah's surprise, he got down on one knee, revealing a vintage ring that she immediately recognized from the photographs, the engagement ring James had given Margaret. "Will you marry me?" he asked simply, because sometimes the greatest truths need the simplest words. "Yes," Hannah answered without hesitation, because some answers are already written on the heart long before the question is asked. When Alexander slid the ring on her finger, Hannah felt as if all the stories, hers, Margaret's, the Montgomery mansions, converge in a single perfect moment of continuity and renewal. Charlotte let out a happy laugh, as if blessing the moment. The white orchids seemed to shine more brightly under the winter garden lights, and somewhere Hannah was sure Margaret Montgomery was smiling. The evening continued with soft music, champagne, and lively conversations about the future of the foundation. But for Hannah, the real miracle lay in the simplicity of the moment and how love had found its way through time, tradition, and change to create something entirely new and yet deeply rooted in history. To the future, Alexander toasted later, when only the closest family remained, for all the stories yet to come. Hannah added, holding Charlotte with one arm, while her vintage engagement ring sparkled on the other hand. And so, under the starry Greenwich sky, Montgomery Manor continued its journey of transformation, no longer just as a house or a cultural center, but as a living testament to the power of love to rewrite histories and redefine traditions.